Christian Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Serenity in the Storm, Living Through Chaos by Leaning on Christ, by Kayleigh McEnany. Narrated by Kayleigh McEnany. To my newborn son, Nash, you are nestled inside my belly as I wrote every word of this book. May you always know that he is walking beside you through every trial you face. Be strong, look up, and know you are a child of Christ. To my daughter, Blake, and husband, Sean, you were both by my side as I penned Serenity in the Storm. You inspire me every single day. I love you. Introduction. A broken country, but a greater God. What is happening to our country? It's a question I find myself asking almost daily. Something has changed in the United States of America, and it transcends politics. God has been exiled, hate proliferates, society perverted, truth rejected, American symbols desecrated. What has become of the country I love so dearly? This cultural shift is far more insidious than the election of any one president or the dominance of any one political party in Washington, D.C. All of that is very important, no doubt, but I am speaking of a dangerous tectonic eruption in the American conscience that is upending us from the inside out, making our country virtually unrecognizable. At the center of this cultural shift is the eradication of God from American society. Look no further than famous atheist Richard Dawkins' assessment. It is fashionable to wax apocalyptic about the threat to humanity posed by the AIDS virus, mad cow disease, and many others, but I think a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. We have seen this shocking, callous attitude manifested in everyday life, in our schools, and in our government. In Bremerton, Washington, a high school sought to stop a football coach from kneeling in silent prayer alone at the 50-yard line. In Nevada, during the COVID-19 outbreak, the directive was clear: open the casinos, close the churches. And in Kentucky, drive-through liquor stores were no problem at all, but drive-in church services, well, that was criminal activity. And yet faith was at the very center of America's founding. Our Declaration of Independence was written with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. At the first presidential inauguration, before swearing the oath, George Washington opened the Bible to Psalm 121:1. I raise my eyes towards the hills. Whence shall my help come? Subsequent presidents also swore the presidential oath of office with one hand on a Bible while reciting the words, "So help me God." During some of America's most exigent moments, from the Civil War in World War I to the Great Depression in World War II, presidents have appealed to God, the very being our country now seeks to ostracize. Meanwhile, there is a new quest to cancel the symbols that bind us together as Americans: our flag, our anthem, our Pledge of Allegiance, even our founding fathers. A New York Times editorial board member announced that she was disturbed to see the American flag. Singer Macy Gray called the flag tattered, dated, divisive, and incorrect. And an Olympic alternate said she dreamed of winning a medal so that she could stand on the podium and burn the American flag, not drape it over her shoulders in appreciation of our magnificent country. My goal is to win the Olympics so I can burn a U.S. flag on the podium, the athlete said in no uncertain terms. Far too many schools are pushing these radical ideas on our children. We are told that parents have no role in their children's education, that elementary-age school children can change their pronouns while their parents remain in the dark. Critical race theory and critical gender theory divide our children. Even preschoolers have racist tendencies, they say. All this as drag queen shows at American schools have become in vogue, with New York City schools spending more than $200,000 taxpayer dollars to bring these provocative performances to elementary, middle, and high schools. The media, for its part, continues to stoke division with furious and fallacious headlines meant to divide us at a time when we already walk on eggshells around one another, concealing our political opinions in fear that we might be canceled. Social media, meanwhile, is a swirling cesspool, poisoning the minds of our children. Inciting competition among young girls in a quest for unattainable perfection, these platforms provoke body image issues, depression, and at times even self-harm. Drug dealers have seized on the newfound power of social media, preying on innocent teenagers, offering fentanyl-laced prescription drugs that prove deadly, and making overdose deaths the #1 killer of young people ages 18 to 45. Senseless, shocking criminal activity has taken over American streets. A woman shoved into the subway tracks falling to her death in Times Square. An innocent little 1-year-old boy shot and killed at a barbecue. A man sucker punched out of nowhere and beaten into a coma. The stories of these victims are endless, while the repercussions for the criminals are often minimal. At its core, it seems some have totally lost sight of the value of human life. That became very clear when I woke up to this headline in June of 2022. U.S. abortions rise. 1 in 5 pregnancies terminated in 2020. 1 in 5. Overall, 63 million children have been lost to the scourge of abortion. 63 million little ones created by God who we will never come to know in this life. All of this as the world is spiraling out of control. In soul-crushing agony, America watched as Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, leaving countless Americans behind and 13 fallen heroes in the wake. Russia invaded Ukraine, bringing us as close to World War III as we have ever been. North Korea is firing off missiles as China circles Taiwan, and Iran awaits another cushy nuclear deal. It is safe to say that America is not just enduring a storm, but a raging hurricane. Society has rejected truth and common sense and opted instead for moral relativism. Up is down, right is wrong, none of it makes sense. But as dim as the future may seem and as hopeless as it may feel, I am here to bring you a message of hope and optimism. While we are up against formidable foes and much adversity, our God is greater. In Afghanistan, even amid despair and human atrocity, the underground church is at work for Christ. We've seen just the same in Syria and Iran, oppressive countries where the Christian community is nevertheless growing. Who would have thought that Iran has the fastest growing church in the world, and there's a revival in northern Syria, according to Joel Richardson of Global Catalytic Ministries? Even though God has been removed from our schools and churches were targeted for closure during COVID-19, the Supreme Court has delivered steady victories for men and women of faith. Furthermore, the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade proved to be the most consequential Supreme Court decision of my lifetime. In deciding to return power to the people, some jurisdictions in this country have now chosen to protect innocent life. Our God is bigger than the challenges we face, and make no mistake, He is at work. In this book, I will walk you through several global political and cultural challenges: the fall of Afghanistan, the war in Ukraine, education, life, liberty, and societal decay. Most of these chapters are accompanied by a subsequent one that highlights how God is moving even now. These are the stories and insights that you will never see on the news and are rarely discussed. It is my hope that this book will give you encouragement at a time when it is in short supply. Among these chapters are 2 that stand out: an all-powerful God in a suffering world, and a proven Savior. These portions of the book raise some of the most challenging questions in life. How can a perfect, all-loving God tolerate a world full of evil, suffering, and pain? And how do we know that God is real, that Jesus Christ is Savior? In these chapters, I survey scholarly literature and biblical text in an effort to provide answers. As you listen to this book, it may be tempting to focus on the many troubles our country faces. These are rocky, tumultuous, uncertain times indeed. As Christians, though, we have cause for hope even amid despair. Why? Because as Pastor Rick Warren aptly observed, our all-powerful God has already written the end of the story. Afghanistan. Chapter 1. The Unfathomable Fall. It was a warm, sunny Friday in August as I hugged my daughter and rushed out the door, down the yellow glossy steps, and toward a large van waiting in my driveway. I grabbed the hefty black handle on the right side of the vehicle and pulled the door toward me with a firm jerk. Climbing up the steps, I rushed to the wooden chair and table placed just in front of a television monitor displaying vibrant tones of yellow, red, and white. Today, this nondescript, rather ordinary-looking van would function as a television studio, permitting me to broadcast from my driveway in Florida and into millions of homes across the country. While my setup was certainly different from the flashy, blazing television sets of New York City, it would get the job done. Noon was approaching, and that meant we were moments away from broadcasting on Fox News' Outnumbered and discussing an increasingly frightening situation halfway across the globe. Though the day in Florida was bright and glimmering with the sun's rays piercing through the palm trees, A far different scene was transpiring just under 8,000 miles away in Kabul, Afghanistan. Back in April, President Biden had announced his plan for a complete withdrawal of the remaining 2,500 American troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, the war's 20th anniversary. "We will not conduct a hasty rush to the exit," Biden promised. "We'll do it responsibly, deliberately, and safely." On the contrary, by that Friday afternoon in August, the Taliban had overtaken the majority of Afghanistan with striking rapidity. American troops and countless citizens remained in harm's way, and the U.S. intelligence assessment suggested the fall of Afghanistan could occur within 3 months. The projection was an abrupt turnaround from what our commander-in-chief had assured the American public just over a month earlier. "The likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely," President Biden told the nation. But the prospects of the Afghan government retaining control of the country appeared far bleaker on the afternoon of Friday, August 13th, 2021. Even so, I never imagined leaving my outnumbered studio van on Friday and returning on Monday to find a newly declared state, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, a murderous and gruesome terrorist safe haven, Americans trapped within. After all, in June, Secretary of State Antony Blinken assured us that the fall of Afghanistan would not be something that happens from a Friday to a Monday. That, however, is exactly what transpired. By Sunday, Taliban fighters overtook the streets of Kabul. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani fled amid allegations that he escaped with more than $150 million in U.S. dollars intended for the Afghan people. Shortly thereafter, the Taliban was handed the presidential palace. Armed Taliban militants were seen posing behind President Ghani's wooden desk, clad in their weaponry. Ironically, one such Taliban militant claimed to have been previously detained in Guantanamo Bay, only to be released by President Obama in the infamous swap of 5 terrorist prisoners for Bo Bergdahl, the American deserter. As Afghanistan's capital descended into anarchy, prisoners were released en masse from the Kabul jail, fleeing on foot. And less than a month later, on the 20th anniversary of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, the Taliban raised their black and white flag over Afghanistan, a country where 2,448 American soldiers lost their lives. While the Taliban entered Kabul, a United States Chinook helicopter was photographed descending parallel to a cloud of billowing black smoke and into the American embassy. The image immediately drew comparisons to the infamous image from the 1975 fall of Saigon, when the United States evacuated a CIA safe house in Saigon after exiting the Vietnam War. That image defined a controversial and tumultuous war in American history, depicting a helicopter perched on top of an evacuation point as throngs of Americans climbed stairs trying to flee. Now, America watched the chaotic final chapter of a war that had defined the 21st century of American history. In the case of Afghanistan, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, told the nation 2 months prior to Kabul's fall, "You can't predict the future, but I don't see Saigon 1975 in Afghanistan. The Taliban just aren't the North Vietnamese army. It's not that kind of situation." Even more brazenly, 1 month later, President Biden echoed the assessment in blunt terms. "There's going to be no circumstance where you're going to see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan," he said. And while the administration dismissed parallels to Saigon, noting that the Afghan evacuation was very deliberate, the comparison was unavoidable to a watching world. The highly unlikely fall of Kabul, as predicted by the commander-in-chief, on the contrary, proved highly likely. Biden's ill-fated prediction of an orderly withdrawal from Afghanistan turned out to be about as accurate as President Barack Obama calling ISIS the JV team, just before the ruthless terrorist group declared a caliphate and took over vast swaths of Syria and Iraq. Grievously wrong, terribly naive. Worse than any naive predictions, though, were the actions of the Biden administration in the aftermath. As Afghanistan fell, our president was not in the White House Situation Room surrounded by military leaders. Rather, our president was at the presidential retreat Camp David, pictured alone at a table, video conferencing government officials about the impending disaster in Afghanistan. The timeline of the president's movements leading up to the fall of Afghanistan tells the story of a country rapidly on the brink of collapse and an administration that did not see it coming. On Wednesday evening, August 11, 2021, days before Afghanistan's Sunday collapse, President Biden met with his team about the gradually worsening conditions in Afghanistan. Based on interviews with 33 U.S. officials and lawmakers, Politico recounted this meeting and several others leading up to Afghanistan's collapse. Ahead of that Wednesday evening meeting, described by an official as a serious moment, Politico characterized the mood in the White House as ebullient. Earlier in that day, President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris had celebrated back-to-back legislative wins, pumping their fist in triumph in the president's private dining room. But the mood was very different that Wednesday night, as the president requested that his top military brass draw up plans for sending American troops back into the increasingly threatened Afghanistan. On Thursday, a sobering meeting took place at 7:30 a.m. in the Situation Room among top national security advisors, where it was determined that Kabul could fall in weeks or days. This was described by a U.S. official as the "oh crap" moment. The stunning news ultimately prompted President Biden to send 3,000 troops to Afghanistan. And as these troops traveled back into the country they were supposed to depart, President Biden left for vacation in Delaware, after spending only 2 days in Washington, D.C. Yes, vacation. Biden was looking forward to his summer vacation, Politico reported. Neither the shocking developments in Afghanistan nor the sending of more U.S. troops prompted President Biden to change his vacation plans. Predictably, he took no questions on his way out the door. It was not until the fall of Afghanistan was imminent that President Biden relocated, not to the White House, but to Camp David, a strategic blunder, no doubt. As White House press secretary, I had been in both the Situation Room and Camp David. The Situation Room, a 5,000-square-foot secure area in the West Wing, served as the location for the Trump-era daily coronavirus task force meetings. I distinctly remember my first time entering the sit room, as we called it. Leaving my phone at the entry point of the complex, I walked into the main conference room. With a large mahogany table in the center and wood paneling outlining the room, the center point of the sit room was the large monitor equipped with secure conferencing capabilities and couched by neon red and green clocks with times from across the globe. During the first coronavirus task force meeting I attended, I took my seat along the wall of the room, reflecting on all of the major consequential operations that had been monitored from this very location. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the death of Osama bin Laden, and so much more. Now, though, as Afghanistan fell, after a 2-decade-long war, where was President Biden? Approximately 70 miles away, President Biden sat almost as a spectator at the president's country residence tucked away in the Katakin Mountain Park. Offering an opportunity for solitude and tranquility as described by the official White House website, Camp David was truly a getaway. I would know. I visited the Woody Retreat the weekend after my first press briefing. Huddled around a fire with my husband in early May of 2020, an intimate group of guests and I enjoyed cocktails, reflecting on my very first briefing before retiring to the dining room for dinner, situated just off the quaint and rather cozy living room where several presidents had celebrated Christmas with their families. The quiet maze of intimate cabins, also known as Shangri-La, indeed offered an escape. Though many presidents hosted foreign leaders at the venue, providing a chance for a more personal interaction, Camp David hardly seemed like the ideal place for observing the fall of a country Americans had fought to liberate from the Taliban for 20 years. As Afghanistan fell during the weekend of August of 2021, I hustled through John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York with my mother, intent on making it to a potential Fox News appearance to react to the jarring images crossing our television screens. The world watched and America took a collective breath in utter disbelief while our president appeared woefully aloof. On that Sunday, the Taliban overwhelmed the streets of Afghanistan's capital, but there was no presidential address to the nation. No questions were taken. Americans were left in the dark. In fact, we had not heard from our so-called commander-in-chief in 6 days. Yes, 6 days. Not only that, an attempt to contact the White House press secretary was met with an automated reply that she would be out of the office until the 22nd of August, nearly a week from the day Kabul fell. When the White House press secretary finally turned off the auto reply, earlier than denoted in her auto response, and held a briefing, We learned from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan that 48 hours after the fall of Afghanistan, the president had still not even picked up the phone to call a single world leader. He has not yet spoken to any other world leaders, Sullivan admitted. Myself, Secretary Blinken, several other senior members of the team have been engaged on a regular basis with foreign counterparts, and we intend to do so in the coming days. Wow. After not speaking to a single world leader or the American public for nearly a week, President Biden announced on Monday, "I will be addressing the nation on Afghanistan at 3:45 p.m. Eastern today." Too little, too late. Afghanistan had fallen, and an undetermined number of U.S. citizens were stranded behind enemy lines. Meanwhile, our nation watched a hurried evacuation effort and the horrific images of Afghans falling from a U.S. aircraft. Desperate Afghans rushed into a U.S. C-17 aircraft intended for U.S. Embassy personnel. In one case, 640 people crowded into a jet meant to carry 150. Video images showed hundreds of Afghan men and women chasing an aircraft during takeoff, trying to escape the Taliban hellhole behind them. The Associated Press describes the moment this way. As the C-17 transporter gains altitude, shaky mobile phone video captures two tiny dots dropping from the plane. The dots, it turns out, were desperate Afghans hidden in the wheel well. As the wheels folded into the body of the plane, the stowaways faced the choice of being crushed to death or letting go and plunging to the ground. Gruesomely, human remains were later discovered in the wheel well of the C-17 military plane. All of this as we waited to hear from our president. When President Biden finally addressed the nation from the East Room of the White House, he used the moment to place blame for the fall of Afghanistan at the foot of his predecessor. When I came into office, I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban, Biden complained. Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just a little over 3 months after I took office. U.S. forces had already drawn down during the Trump administration from roughly 15,500 American forces to 2,500 troops in country. The remarks echoed President Biden's previous attempt to blame President Trump. When I came into office, I inherited a deal cut by my predecessor, Biden said in a Saturday night statement, one of the only presidential communications during his 6-day period of silence. Now, he was using his first public, on-camera remarks to do just the same. Biden quickly moved from blaming Trump to blaming the Afghans, noting that we gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force. We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future. After using much of his speech to point fingers, President Biden then had the audacity to declare, "I am President of the United States of America, and the buck stops with me." And all of those whom he chose to blame, of course. The buck stops with me empty promise, contradicted by his effort to place blame, reflected a similar vow that then-candidate Joe Biden had made on the campaign trail. It's hard to believe this has to be said, but unlike this president, I'll do my job and take responsibility. I won't blame others. And I'll never forget that the job isn't about me, it's about you. Right. Predictably, some in the media, like MSNBC's Nicole Wallace and Brian Williams, chose to cover for the president following his disaster of a speech. Wallace praised Biden as being unapologetic and confident with resolve, only to be outdone by Williams. I'm curious to hear your reaction to this consequential speech by the American president, Williams said on his show to U.S. Army veteran Matt Zeller. Didn't run from it, he owned it. He owned his decision. He owned the fact that, as he put it, the buck stops with me. Did I watch a different speech, I wondered? It appears that I was not the only one with that thought. Zeller, the veteran, replied, I hope he gets to own their deaths too. I feel like I watched a different speech than the rest of you guys. I was appalled. There was such a profound, bold-faced lie in that speech, the idea that we planned for every contingency. I've been personally trying to tell this administration since it took office that this was coming. We sent them plan after plan about how to evacuate these people. Nobody listened to me. Despite the delusional defenses of some in the media, by Tuesday, the list of critics of Biden's Afghanistan policy was long and bipartisan. The debacle in Afghanistan is the worst kind, Avoidable, read the Washington Post editorial board headline. Biden's betrayal of Afghans will live in infamy, noted the typically liberal Atlantic. And the New York Times' David Sanger wrote, Biden will go down in history, fairly or unfairly, as the president who presided over a long-brewing, humiliating final act in the American experiment in Afghanistan. Obama officials far and wide, from former Secretary of Homeland Security Jeh Johnson and Ambassador to Afghanistan Ryan Crocker, to former senior advisor to the president David Axelrod, and CIA directors Leon Panetta, David Petraeus, and John Brennan, all criticized the Biden administration to varying degrees. I'm left with some grave questions in my mind about his ability to lead our nation as commander-in-chief, to have read this so wrong, or even worse, to have understood what was likely to happen and not care, remarked Crocker. They clearly were caught off guard by the events of the last 72 hours, Brennan said. In many ways, I think of John Kennedy in the Bay of Pigs, Panetta offered, analogizing the fall of Afghanistan to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Nevertheless, the predictable cheerleaders still did their cheerleading. The president is to be commended for his strong leadership and exceptional focus, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said in a statement. But the bad just kept getting worse for the Biden administration. As the week progressed, the administration suffered from catastrophic communications failures, first from the White House spokespeople and next from the president himself. For example, one of the pointed questions from the press was just how many American citizens remained stranded in Afghanistan. On Tuesday morning, Department of Defense Press Secretary John Kirby told us approximately 5,000 to 10,000 Americans were in Afghanistan. By the afternoon, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki had the number at 11,000, before the State Department and Pentagon officials estimated that the number was actually somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000. No one seemed to have an accurate count. Then came President Biden's disastrous interview with George Stephanopoulos. We've all seen the pictures. We've seen those hundreds of people packed into a C-17. We've seen Afghans falling, Stephanopoulos said, leading Biden to quickly and callously quip, "That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago." 4 or 5 days ago? As if the loss of human life had an expiration date? Then Stephanopoulos remarked, "Still a lot of pandemonium at the airport." Biden replied with foreboding words as he knocked on the wooden table beside him. "But no one's being killed right now. God forgive me if I'm wrong about that, but no one's being killed right now." It was an ill-fated prediction that would unfortunately prove untrue in time. President Biden's sit-down interview with Stephanopoulos came as chaos and mayhem began to unfold at the Kabul airport. American citizens attempted to make their way to evacuation flights only to encounter tens of thousands of local Afghans blocking the gates. Stun grenades flashed in an effort to disperse the crowd as Taliban militants shot into the air. Taliban beat and whipped innocent Afghans, some of whom were pictured holding their babies over the gates, trying to offer their own flesh and blood to an American soldier in hopes that their little ones would escape life under the Taliban. A British officer told The Independent the mothers were desperate. They were getting beaten by the Taliban. They shouted, "Save my baby," and threw the babies at us. Some of the babies fell on the barbed wire. It was awful what happened. By the end of the night, there wasn't one man among us who was not crying. But to President Biden, the Taliban was being cooperative to some degree. I think they're going through sort of an existential crisis about do they want to be recognized by the international community as being a legitimate government, Biden told Stephanopoulos. Really? As they took young women into forced marriages and beat innocent civilians, they were calculating the odds of their acceptance into the international community? Hardly. Biden went on to say, "I'm not sure I would have predicted, George, nor would you or anyone else, that when we decided to leave, that they'd provide safe passage for Americans to get out. The havoc and turmoil at the gates of the Kabul airport surely were not the picture of safe passage. But here was our president telling the American people otherwise." The day following President Biden's indefensible interview, the White House press shop, in a rare move, did not schedule the daily briefing that they vowed to have each weekday. Indeed, during Press Secretary Jen Psaki's very first White House briefing, she assured the press that she would usher in a return to these daily briefings Monday through Friday. but apparently not on Thursday, August 19th, 2021.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?